matzot mitzvah, which is the name of our company, for this matzot mitzvah matzahs, for the sake of the commandment. So it has to have it has a real purpose built in. And so then to think, well, actually, what is the purpose of matzah? What is the job of matzah? The Jewish job of matzah is about this commandment that relates to telling the story of the Exodus. You know the soul of the slave, the Torah says, and sort of instilling an embodied sense of slavery and helping us to have empathy for those who don't, to increase freedom in the world. That's what the Torah means for the sake of the mitzvah of matzah. And that's deep. And then here comes a corporation and said, and then it sort of deepened, because after this takeover of Manischewitz, I follow them on their social media. I started getting ads for, I forget, it was like Moshe the Matzah Man or whoever it was, but it was like some matzah doll, like a toy for kids. And then soon after, we started getting advertisements like, get our like onion flavored matzah and our, and there's nothing wrong. Like I also enjoy, variety and the specialization of the supermarket. But I realized that all of these things weren't fundamentally designed for any reason other than money first. And what I find was that looking at matzah and saying, how can we design, advertise, market, and get matzahs to people, to consumers, in ways that enhance the mitzvah? And so even if someone's declaring it's intentional, but the real intention of the matzah is to make money. So, and that's reflected in the price, and that's reflected in the product. So that was A. B is that matzah has flattened and hardened over time. Originally, sources talk about 3-inch thick matzah, so 3 inches. It's like an unleavened bread. And I think we're used to translating it as an unleavened bread, but somehow unleavened bread, that is really dense bread, became flat cracker. And those are different items. And part of it was the machine matzah. They didn't want it to become moldy. My wife is a descendant of the Horowitz Margaretten family. They opened the first matzah factory. The Manischewitzes claimed they were the first in Cincinnati. It's not true. They were the second in the 1880s. These two companies, one in Cincinnati, one in New York, opened, and they said, no mold. We don't want mold. We can't have bread that goes moldy because we can't sell as much of it. So we're going to flatten it and make it hard like a cracker so it won't go moldy. And rabbis at the time were irate. Machines are making this matzah. The machine operator is declaring it's intentional and flipping on the switch. And who's supervising it? And it's flat like a cracker. This is a terrible heresy. And so there was tremendous rabbinic opposition to the matzah mafias, as it were, of the 1880s and 90s. Incidentally, we just had a family call with the Horowitz Margaretten family over Zoom for the first time ever. The whole family got together, and there are actually other people in the family making matzah still. It's like a thing. And so that was part of it. And then rabbis contributed to the problem because they started to endorse this as, well, if it's flatter and more cracker-like, it's less likely to rise. And so maybe that's better. And so these are two wrong impulses. The first impulse is, let's change our religious product to make more money. And the second bad impulse is, let's take an unleavened bread and make it into a cracker because that's better religiously, because it won't be chametz, it won't rise. Why is that bad? I want to say something about that. The reason you might think that's good. The reason that's bad is because when we talk about an unleavened bread, you want to kind of ask the question, why is this night different from all other nights? It may sound familiar. And like, honestly, on many other nights, people do eat bread with their meal. Bread is sort of still a staple of meals. And to have an unleavened bread is a sharp distinction. To have a cracker actually it's not similar enough to the bread to really do it. I'll add another piece. There are different understandings about what matzah is, but one is that it's the food the slaves ate. That's what the Ibn Ezra said. So it's reminiscent of the food the slaves ate. And the slaves didn't eat over burnt crackers. They were given dense unleavened bread in this understanding. I don't know if it's true or not, but the interpretation is that it's because it fills you up for a long time. And so this matzah is really dense, and you need the density and the heaviness of a thick unleavened bread to really get that. So we started this project to open our own. So my wife was like, great, you're complaining again, do something about it or shut up. That's actually what she said. And
yeah, my wife has said similar things.
Yeah. And so I was like, well, you're the matzah, you're a descendant of the matzah bakers. Let's you tell us how to do it. So we consulted with people and we learned about matzah baking and bakers and whatever. So we opened a factory and we went through one of Claw's incubators with some fine folks were in that incubator. And one of the things we came to was that our profit model, like, where are we going to put the money? So we're going to put the money to the cause. And what's the cause? The cause is freedom from slavery. And what is the best analog to slavery? Slavery. Because there are between 20 and 40 million people who are currently enslaved. That's a lot of people. People speak about deaths from the coronavirus. 1 million, 2 million would be astounding. Well, there are between 20 and 40 million people who are actually in chains, not figuratively, but actually in chains right now, primarily women and children. And it happens in all 50 states, happens here. Even in Rhode Island, there are a couple of hundred cases. So it's not a foreign thing. And we're all complicit in it. So that brings me to point 2, if that's okay. And that's coronavirus. So one of the things that, so just so people know, all of our profits go to fight human trafficking. That's the Bain Capital inspired us, lots of profit. Our matzah also costs a lot of money. We have great margins on our matzah. We're not, people are like, oh, so you should charge less. No, we're charging just as much, but we're sending all profits to fight human trafficking. That's the thing. 2, I think the coronavirus has helped with the collective action problem. Obviously, it's not a good thing, but one of the things it's exposed is that, first of all, when there are struggles with people who are vulnerable in vulnerable classes, like people without healthcare or people who can't afford not to go to work or can't afford not to take public transportation. Like in Manhattan, there are pictures of mainly minorities on subways because they have to go to work, right? And talking about the spread in those communities. And yes, actually, that's one of our realities. But there's a complicity that everyone else has in not sharing the wealth with those people so that they're not in that situation that's actually going to kill everyone. So, so people are aware of the collective nature of our problems, that you can't just hide away as a free, now I am a free Jewish person and I'm free from Egypt. I was a slave, but hell yeah, now I'm Pharaoh. You can't do that because it's not a binary. We're all in it together. And then the collective action and the solution, right? So we all need to solve the problem together. Any one person who goes out and breaks the social distancing rules is fairly unlikely to contract the coronavirus, but everyone doing it leaves enough people likely to contract the coronavirus that our healthcare system is overwhelmed and lots of us die and it's horrible. Right. And we're all willing to sacrifice. So I think it's tangible now. Slavery is something we're equally complicit in. So people don't realize it's about 25 industries in the US that have trafficking, and it's different industries a little bit internationally. If you want to check out where, Polaris did a typologies of human trafficking that you can find on their website. They're an anti-trafficking organization, North Star, Polaris, and their study is really great. But a lot of them are restaurants, nail salons, agriculture. And so if you'd ask someone, where did you get your tomato? Well, I got it in the supermarket. Well, who farmed your tomato? Well, I don't know, a farmer. Maybe it says the name of the farm. Well, do you know? So people joke like Portlandia, oh, you know the name of the cow that's your hamburger, or, I got a box from Thrive Marketplace online food and it said it was packed by Stacy. So I know Stacy. So people joke, oh, that's cute. You're trying to connect. You don't know anything about Stacy. But actually, what we do know is that large subsections of the industries we all rely on for affordable food, the way they keep their prices down in many cases are by enslaving or trafficking people. There's abusing workers on one hand and not giving them sick leave. And then there's the deeper manifestation of the corporate abuse, which is we'll just steal you and lock you up and give ourselves free labor. And we are all complicit in those industries. And it's almost impossible to be clean. Just like, rabbis are worried about matzah rising and leavening. Well, we could all be equally worried about, like, where are there slaves in my food production, in my nail salon, in my shopping mall? So, so I think coronavirus highlights what matzah is trying to do, which is to be a food of slavery and freedom, and to say, actually, the lines are a lot blurrier than you think. And we all have to be in it collectively to free ourselves, to continuously be increasing freedom. That's the second piece. The third piece is Naomi has felt from the beginning, like if we really want to empower people, we don't want to start another matzah company and redirect the profit. What we really ought to do is have people bake their own matzah. And I pushed back and I said, but there's no money in that. We can't make a brand on what we're going to sell you flour in a rolling pin. I mean, in other words, like people can get their own flour without us and they can get their own rolling pin. They don't need us to do that. We're going to sell overpriced flour and brand it. Just it'll be a pure vanity branding. So actually, this presents. This is part 3 of the 3-piece is that we've always wanted people. It's about empowering people. People used to bake their own matzah, and it's. I think people have been led by the rabbinic attitude that says you should be afraid of it rising. Say, well, like I can't bake matzah. I don't know how to. There must be some magic knowledge. And part of what we're here to do is say no. Now, there are stringent rules that are technical about the flour. There are debates. So those debates can lose people. Do you have to guard if you get flour in a market, they've often treated it with water. And if you're really concerned about it rising, or maybe it's been treated with, and why? Because flour in silos explodes. So to prevent it from exploding, they treat it. So the question is that a problem? And rabbinic authorities debate that. So I think these technical debates scare people a little into thinking, well, I can't bake my own matzah. The good thing is, even if you're like very Orthodox, rabbinic authorities agree that in a time of pressing need, everyone can just get flour from the shuk, from the market. So this year, everyone's okay. There's sort of opinions. You have to guard it from contact of water from the time of harvesting, the time of grinding, from the time of kneading the dough, or the very last is just whatever, just make your matzah, and it hasn't risen. So, but the basic point I want to say is that people should feel empowered to bake their own matzah. It's the simplest food imaginable by definition. That it's designed to be the simplest food. It's just flour and water. And so we produced this video. And it's not in our factory because we closed our factory down because of COVID-19. It's in my home kitchen. And it's not with our special shmora flour. One disclaimer for those who are religiously punctilious. Our flour we normally use is a great flour for main grains, and it is guarded from the time of harvest, so it comes into no contact with water and all that. But you'll get the idea from the video, and I hope people will make their own matzah.
Yeah, so we're going to show that video now, and we will discuss it on the other end of it. So hopefully I know how to do this properly. I think I learned how to share a video properly, and I just have to find it because it didn't come up as immediately as I thought it would. So, oh, there it is. Okay, so I'm going to share that, and let's pick it up on the other side.
Great.
Yep. Well, this is live TV, so I think that I have to. It's asking me for a password, so we will. It's not the.
Oh, here it is.
Okay, and we're live here, baking with Barry. We're doing matzah for Jewish Live. Credit to Naomi Bean, my wife and co-founder of our venture, Mitzvah Matzahs, for getting this set up. It's like running a cooking show. So we're going to be making matzah today. Many people have become disempowered and think that you have to buy matzah in a box. That isn't so. One disclaimer, religious disclaimer, there are a lot of different opinions about what flour you can or can't use to make matzah, and that's because the flour might have been sprayed with water or other substances and hasn't necessarily been guarded from moisture. There's something called shmora matzah, means guarded. The Torah in Exodus says, Ushmartem et hamatzot, and you should guard the matzah. And that means different things. There's debates in the sages. We don't have to get into all of it now. Some say it means you should guard the matzah from the harvest. Others say it means you should guard the matzah to make sure the flour hasn't contacted water from the time of kneading. And others say it means that it just has to be intentional. You have to declare that you're making matzah as opposed to chancing on an unleavened bread. So all of that's a sort of way of background. I'm not here to opine about that, other than to say that according to most opinions, certainly in an odd situation or unusual circumstance, you can use this matzah and just make sure that from the time of kneading, it's okay. The matzah we use in the Mitzvah Matzah's factory is shmora flour. It's guarded from the time of the harvest. Okay, that's the disclaimer. So we're going to be making matzah. Pretty straightforward. The first thing you're going to want to do is declare that you're doing it for the intention of making matzah. This is an intentional food item. So there's a sort of religious practice to making this food, and that's by saying the three words, l'shem matzot mitzvah. That's l'shem matzot mitzvah, or l'shem matzah's mitzvah in the Ashkenazis. And that is for the sake of the mitzvah, the commandment of making matzah. Now, this is a different flour than we've used in our factory, so I'm not sure exactly how it's going to come out. But we've weighed out here about 600 grams or 4 cups of flour. You can see there. And we're using today a King Arthur organic white whole wheat flour. Again, not what we use in our matzah factory, but that's what I've got in my house today. And that might be more similar to what you're going to have. You're not going to have a guarded whole wheat matzah from whole wheat flour from Maine. And so there's about 4 cups of that, 600 grams. And I have here about just under 400 milliliters of water. Another caveat or disclaimer. There's something called mayim shalanu, water that's rested. When they used to get well water, there was a concern it would be heated from the sun or other things, and so it would cause the matzah to rise. And so there was a custom to leave the water out overnight. But according to almost all modern authorities, if you're working with cold, cool tap water, it's not an issue. So you want to be working with the cool water, though. That's the tradition. Now, a few rules, and then we'll get at it, and it's really simple. First rule, it is the bread of affliction. 2 ingredients, water and flour. That's it. That's all we've got going on here. Second rule, 18 minutes from the time that the water hits the flour. We have 18 minutes to get this matzah out of the oven. Third rule, you're going to be wanting to knead the matzah, the flour, the dough, vigorously the whole time. The ideal is to constantly be kneading and to never let it rest. If you're doing multiple batches, you're going to want to clean your equipment to make sure there's no leftover dough. And so that's part of it. And you're also going to want to set an 18-minute timer or have a time-telling device around to get your matzah out of the oven on time. Things you'll need: a mixing bowl, water. Rolling pin could come in handy. You may or may not want a surface of some kind. You could use the counter if you're a kind of sticky baking surface, and a docker. There are fancy metal ones. This is from an online kit to start your own pizza shop. And this puts holes in the matzah, and that prevents air pockets and air bubbles from developing. Also, it's extremely therapeutic. We're back. That was my wife from the other room reminding me that most people do not have a docker. I'm going to insist you're going to want to get one of these medieval torture devices. It is extremely therapeutic and a healthy way to take out your aggression. But if you do not have a docker, a fork will do just fine. So you can take a fork and poke holes in your matzah. But get yourself a docker. You won't regret it. Okay. So with that, I think we're going to go. We've heated our oven here to 550. Now we're making a soft matzah. Some people think this is the Sephardic style matzah, and you can see our website for more about that, or interview on Judaism Unbound. It doesn't have to be that hot. I would recommend heating your oven up to the highest temperature it'll get to, and putting the baking sheet that you're going to use, we're using just a cookie tray there, in to let it get hot. Okay. So you'll pour the water in. Say l'shem matzot mitzvah, and from that time you have 18 minutes to go. You want to knead and see how what the consistency is, and knead vigorously. You just want to keep kneading this until all of the water gets incorporated. And you can judge based on the humidity of the flour, your particular circumstances, if your dough is too dry or too wet. But again, this looks like it's okay for us today. We're using here again, I got about 600 or too wet grams of flour. Again, and about 400 milliliters of water. And the harder you work matzah, we're using here again I got about 600 grams of flour. Again, and about 400 milliliters of water. You can see there, but kind of turning it into the harder you work matzah, we're using here again I got about 600 grams of flour. Again, we'll see how many this will make, but I would think this will make about six or so 7-inch matzahs. You can make fewer, smaller matzahs, but 6 will be enough for 2 seders. A note while we're doing this about challah, some people have the custom to take an amount out in remembrance of an offering that used to be given to the priest, the Kohen. That only happens with a minimum amount, according to classic Jewish law. Maybe it's about 12 cups of flour, maybe 16. So we're not at enough of that here to make the blessing. We've got a beautiful dough here. This is right on. So that ratio that I suggested will work well with, maybe it's a little wet, but you see that's a nice dough. Then you want to knead it. The more kneading, the better it's going to be. And you want to give it a vigorous, it's a good rule of thumb. Let's give it about 25 or 30 solid kneads until it becomes a little more Play-Doh-like, like some kind of putty. Now, I'm not a baker. I've never successfully baked a loaf of bread. Matzah is foolproof. Anyone can do it. This here is a little wet, so in an ideal world, we might have floured our surface in advance. We didn't do that. Now my hands are a little sticky, but if you're at home, you'll probably want to have a little flour on your tabletop surface. It'll make it easier when you roll the matzah out. One of the reasons why we bake a soft matzah at a slightly lower temperature than a traditional cracker matzah is that in a cracker matzah, if you use that high temperature, it cooks all the way through. It's very thin, but in a soft matzah, you'll sear the outside, but the inside won't fully cook. So you want to cook it at a little bit of a lower temperature so that it cooks evenly through. The ideal, if you have it, most people do not, is to have a perforated pan. I don't know if you can see, but I'm rolling this into like a log now. So I've got a nice dough so that I can cut it into even pieces. You might use a knife. To do that, if you have a cutter, but if not, plain old knife. What you want to do maybe is make yourself from these 2 logs of 2, and out of each of those 3. So you'll have 6 total. Split it twice, once into 2 and once into 3. You can be as exact or imperfect as you like, depending on your personality, need for perfection. Okay. Then you're going to take your rolling pin, move the bowl out of the way. So you're going to take one of these and flatten it out a bit. Now, I'm not using the ideal rolling pin here. We're working from our home kitchen, not our factory. The ideal is to use, I think, what they call the French rolling pins. They kind of are gradated with a slope out, but this will do the trick. Get a nice round circle going. The beautiful matzah, maybe See there, maybe this is about 1/3 of an inch thick, 1/4 of an inch thick. See that? Nice matzo. Make a great matzo pizza. Have fun with the shape. Then you want to take your docker and just give some holes in each side. Again, the more holes, the better. The fewer the air pockets. So now you see we'll have a matzo with holes. There. Just put that to the side. And you'll do that with each of your matzos. Now, in addition to making them in the 18 minutes, it's important that you look for signs of leavening, sort of cracks in the dough or other things that suggest that it has risen. If you've done this correctly, it won't rise at all. There'll be no signs. I would say that's likely what's going to happen. But if your matzah does, on the off chance that it rises, obviously it's not matzah, it's leavened bread. So try again. This is a great activity for the family. Also to get kids involved. Kids love to work with dough. Their hands a little messy. It's a good way to re-empower people. A lot of people make their own challah for Shabbat. For some reason, people think they can't do matzah. They've been taught that it's fraught. It used to be in Europe and in other places, every community would make their own matzah. Okay, so we've got 3 pretty beautiful matzahs there, if I don't say so myself. Now, you don't want any loose flour on them or anything like that, because that might not really cook. So you want to avoid having sort of tons of flour. So you don't want it to be too wet, not too dry. It's kind of a fine balance. But again, this 600 to 400 ratio seems to work pretty well for many kinds of flour. A little bit smaller. Got just 2 left. Just a note while I'm doing this about why it is that matzah became flat and cracker-like. There are kind of 2 reasons. One was the 1880s, 90s, the Manischewitz factory and the Horowitz Margaretin factory. Horowitz was in New York and Manischewitz in Cincinnati got going. And they started making machine matzah, which a lot of people are used to, as opposed to handmade matzah. They wanted those to be shelf stable, not to go moldy or bad like bread. So they started making them cracker-like, and then was a big controversy at the time, especially because, as you see, it has to be an intentional project. So question arose, is it sufficient to have the operator of the machine have intention, l'shem matzah mitzvah, that it's for the sake of matzah, or do you really need a handmade product? Still, many of the Hasidic groups insist on handmade matzah, but most other people have come to rely on the machines, but there's no replacement for making it like by hand. The other reason for the flattening of matzah was to make it less likely to rise, sort of legal stringency. So 2 things turned the bread of affliction into the cracker of affliction. You can see these are, still thin, still flat, very dense. Sometimes people say they're like pita, but they're really not. Denser than that. Then you want to take your baking tray out and get your matzahs on. Lay them on kind of flat. Baking tray out and get your matzahs on. Lay them on kind of flat. I'm only going to fit about 4 on here. See? Cut those in. Maybe I'll get another tray to finish the final 2. See that there? And of course, you want to check to see how much time is left on your 18 minutes. And you'll probably want these to be in the oven, until fully cooked, but not until overcooked, for about between 4 and 8 minutes, depending on the size and temperature of your oven. So we'll see you when they're ready. And we're back. Just taking the matzah out of the oven now. And I see these here. They got a nice golden brown to them. And something you might want to do, just to make sure they're done, you don't want them to be raw, wet. You might want to stick a toothpick in, make sure it comes out clean, that it's cooked, and you kind of see inside. If you're not sure, you can cut one open to test, but you want them not to be raw anymore. And you're also going to want to flip them when you take them out so they don't condense. Maybe move them around and let them cool somewhere with good ventilation. They can get kind of soggy in the cooling procedure. Let's take the last batch out of the oven. Also looking good. Those a little more charred on the other end. As you can see, they got a little sort of golden brown to them, and that's basically making matzah. If you can work with a perforated pan, that'll be even better. So this concludes our initial run of Baking with Barry. Thanks for joining. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot an email over to info@mitzvahmatzos.org. That's mitzvahmatzos.org. And we'll do our best in this crazy time to help you out. But good luck if you don't have matzah or just decide you want to bake your own this year. Good luck baking matzah.
That was awesome.
Oh,
I think you're a natural. I'd like to see that show on a weekly basis.
I used to watch food TV a lot as a teenager to distract myself from anything else. And so
who knew that would pay off in your role as a rabbi?
Yes, right.
So I was watching, and I think I was answering correctly to some of the Facebook comments that were going by. But just to clarify that, first of all, the proportions are 600 milligrams of flour to 400 milliliters of water.
Yeah, that's what I was using. Actually, I really had about 390 milliliters of water in there. I would say if you do 600 to 400, that'll probably be too wet. But 600 to like 390 will be okay. If you do 380, you'll be fine too. But the less water, the more you'll have to need to get the water in, and the harder it'll be. But once you have too much water, it becomes sticky and impossible to work with. And so probably between 390 and 400 is where you'll cross the line. So if people are really looking to do this, I would say, like, if you could be at 392, you'll have a great matzah. And if you go to 401, you're going to be like, damn it, I messed up. So that's what's going to happen.
And let me ask you, I have some personal stake in this, but let's say that you needed to have a gluten-free matzah. Would you be able to use oat flour, and would it be the same proportions?
Probably not. So even you could use oat flour, but it wouldn't be the same proportions. Matzah can be made with any one of 5 grains: wheat, barley, spelt, oat, and rye. There's actually a debate, an academic debate, about whether oats are one of those 5, but let's just say they are for now, because otherwise what would people that can't eat gluten do? And it's good that it worked out that way. The higher the gluten content in your flour, the more water you're probably going to need, I think. And oats don't have gluten. I don't know what the protein is in oat. I'm not a food scientist, though some of my friends are. So, so if you're using like a high protein whole wheat flour, a high gluten flour, like a pizza crust flour, something like that, you may need more water than a white flour, which you may find that the ratio I gave you is bad. But with oats, I would say test it out. The 600 grams of flour is kind of a nice number because it's 4 dry cups in a measure, and it usually produces 6, I would say, medium matzahs, which is perfect for 2 seders if you want. 3 per seder, 2 seders, it kind of works well. So I would use the same amount, but I would probably make a batch and pour in water and just see, what the amount was that worked. We can try it out on this end and get back to folks at some point about.
Yeah, that would be great. And yeah, I mean, I think that there's some people who, from a religious point of view, might say, well, that may or may not be officially a matzah. But I think a lot of people would say, well, it's kosher for Passover, and it's something that looks like a matzah, and it's all I can eat as a gluten-free person. And it would be great to know.
I think almost all rabbis would say that is a matzah. All rabbis would say very few things, but I think almost all rabbis would say your oat matzah is a matzah. So I think I don't want to take a license to speak for all rabbis, but it's probably okay. I just, and that's one of the first items we're going to expand to, when we perfect this product, which I think we've got now is oat for the next year, for just that reason. But yeah, so I would experiment.
Okay, and then the other question that somebody was asking is just, you talked about an intention that you traditionally say, and it's l'shem matzot mitzvah, right?
Yeah, l'shem matzot mitzvah.
And is that all you say, or there's like a baruch, or no, it's just those 3 words?
That's it, l'shem matzot mitzvah. And it can actually become kind of like a mantra in some of the factories, if you visit in like the Lower East Side, where you get people working again and again and again. It's like l'shem matzot mitzvah. And some people actually say it again and again as they bake. They keep reciting it. You only have to. You don't have to do anything. But if you're following these rules, you say it once. But some of the Hasidic people would kind of like chant it over and over again as a kind of to keep focused.
And the idea there is that in a way, what makes it a matzah, I mean, there's sort of 2 things that make it a matzah, as I understand you. One is that it didn't rise, and it's otherwise 18 minutes, whatever, but like the basic idea is that it's a bread that didn't rise. And number 2 is that you intended for it to be matzah, right?
Right, and that's actually one of the rabbinic interpretations of ushmartem et hamatzot, and guard the matzah. What do we mean guard? So one understanding in the medieval authorities is guard it from rising. But the other understanding of guard it is actually like you should kind of like cherish it almost, right? Or you should be like really putting your soul into the matzah. If you think about something you guard closely, you keep it close to the chest kind of. So it's almost like an affection to the matzah. Like, I'm going to use this matzah for a Passover Seder. This is my matzah.
Right.
And there's something nice about people doing it themselves, because there's a personal element to that, right? To have someone else do that for your matzah. Well, you weren't there when they expressed this affection to the dough. They're in a factory in Brooklyn somewhere. So it's kind of nice to be able to do it yourself.
Absolutely. And that's where I think that this year, I mean, why we wanted to do this was just on the presumption that there's a lot of people that aren't going to really want to leave their house as much as possible. They're going to want to stay home. So maybe, like, rather than scouring the neighborhood for matzah, maybe you could make your own matzah. Or maybe if somebody, just sort of, there are all kinds of reasons that I think this year in particular, people might not be able to have matzah, or they might think that they can't have matzah. And it turns out that in basically less than an hour, 18 minutes of actual work, but gathering the ingredients, whatever, it can't possibly take more than an hour, you can have matzah.
And I want to stress how easy this is. Maybe I hedged on this a little bit in the video, but I want to come back from my hedging. I hedged because of, all of these like complicated rabbinic discussions about your flour and was your flour guarded and wasn't it? And does that mean that it can be the matzah or it can't be the matzah? And can it be kosher for Passover, but not your matzah? And, every permutation of opinions is out there. But, and so there's this sense of like, well, this year is different, so this year we could do it. But I do think there's a corrective here, which is that, like, no, this is a holiday, and there's something profound about preparing your own ritual food intentionally, and forget less than an hour. I mean, I really think, I talked because I'm a rabbi. Most people don't have that occupational hazard. They're not going to talk for 12 minutes before they start baking. You get the flour, and if you have flour, you pour it into the thing. And I think, yeah, should I go out to the supermarket and, risk infecting someone or getting infected, or just bake?
Yeah.
I think that puts them in contrast in a certain way.
Yeah, and when I was saying like up to an hour, I was sort of including the part about like, where is the rolling pin? I got to find it.
Right.
That
like I haven't used that in.
But like, it just can't be more than that. Like, that's where I think people stress out, and I think that maybe that's like a good transition to talking more broadly about Passover.
Can I tell you a story?
Yeah, please.
So I was brought in by a school to run a matzah baking workshop with the kids. And there was some I'm not going to name the school. There was some miscommunication. So I came in lugging 50-pound bags of flour on my back like a slave in Egypt. And I go to the customer, I say, okay, so like, are we going in the kitchen? They said, oh, actually, no, there's a caterer working in our kitchen now. We're going to do it in our class. And I was like, well, that's nice, but here are some students with desks, fourth graders. How are we going to make, I've got flour, but I mean, I don't have bowls, I don't have rolling pins, I don't have docker, we don't even have an oven. How are we going to get this into matzah? And we kind of improvised. We didn't really plan it out so well. And we found like some bowls that they were storing supplies in, and we rinsed them in like the water fountain, and we put the bowls on the desk, and we got some water in people's cups that they were holding pens in, and we put it, and there was a toaster oven in the class to warm snacks. So we started making the matzah in the toaster oven, and we didn't have rolling pins. We just took the matzah and just rolled it with our hands, and it was fine. They were ugly, but we had toaster oven matzah, and it was fine. So,
right. I mean, there's something broader about Passover that I think that this leads to, which is sort of like two things that are both happening right now, and that I kind of want to name for folks that are watching and that are very stressed out, because I'm hearing a lot of people are very stressed out about Passover this year, because even if it's like one of those things, like, even if I didn't really like it the way that we usually do it, I knew how to do it the way we usually do it. And now I have no idea what we should be doing on all kinds of levels. Like, we're going to be on Zoom, we're not going to be on Zoom, it's going to be lonely. How do we even, we're not going to have all the foods. What do we do? And I guess I want to say two things that you could think that they're in tension, but I think that you can help us also see that they're not. One is that you're an Orthodox rabbi. So I want to point that out for people watching this who may be concerned about, well, how official is, this or that opinion. So at least, I'm not saying you're representing all Orthodox rabbis, but I'm saying that at least you are an Orthodox rabbi. And so at least what you have to say about these things is a little bit in the realm of that side of things.
I'm not alone also. I've seen
right, no, for sure. But I just want to sort of like point that out, because it's one thing for me to say something, because everybody knows that I don't play by the rules, but at least, there's that part of it. But the other is that Passover in particular is one of, probably with Hanukkah, the most non-rabbinic involved Jewish holidays. Like, you do all the rituals at home with your own family, and it's very rare that there's anybody in authority involved in any dimension of it. And it's a little more complex than that, because technically you're supposed to go to synagogue on Passover, but whatever, most of the people, what they're experiencing is, so the question, but like you said at the beginning, the one thing that people tend not to think that way about is the matzah itself. And so you've now shown us that you can make the matzah yourself, and it's fine. And I guess where I'd love to explore also is where you're thinking about other practices for the Seder that people are used to thinking like, we're supposed to do it this particular way, and maybe that way may not be fully available this year. And it's okay, there are other ways to do it as well. So I don't know if that what that leads to you, for you to think about.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think people know a lot of Haggadot have these instructions like cover the matzah, uncover the matzah, lift up the matzah, recover the matzah, and it's kind of like this ninja thing with the matzah. And part of that is because of this rabbinic teaching that lechem she'onim alav dvarim harbe, that matzah is a bread product that sort of starts many stories or starts a lot of thought lines going. And so the matzah is the conversation piece, very literally, for the Seder. So making your own matzah should be related to the Seder conversation. In other words, it's supposed to be something about this food prompts like the child's question and prompts the story, and it's the food, and it's actually it's an embodied experience of eating, or what I call gastronomic experiential education. But eating matzah is supposed to prompt this whole thing of, well, we were slaves, now we're free, right? Like just the feeling of this is dense, this is horrible, we ate this on the way out. You can't substitute for difficult digestion, and just when you take that bite of the matzah, the taste, and to highlight that the rabbis even banned matzah the day of Passover until you eat the matzah, and some people don't eat it for a month before, and some people the whole year, to really highlight it. So what might those things be? So I'm thinking out loud because I don't know, and I hear different things in contrast, but there's a teaching that the questions really prompt the Seder, and there's a lot of things done to encourage questions. But Maimonides quotes the Talmud in saying that even if you don't have anyone to ask, you ask yourself. So that's Mo. You ask yourself the questions. I'm thinking about someone at a Seder alone that's going to not just recite 4 questions, but ask themselves the 4 questions. Like, why is this night different from all other nights? And so there are sort of 2 impulses, I think, that I want to name out there. I don't think any of them are bad. I have my preference. I think one of them is to have like Zoom Seders, and well, we can't be with people, so let's do the same thing we're doing in every other sphere, which is like what we're doing now, which is like, let's connect digitally. And I think there's something nice about that. And even Orthodox rabbis have started to figure out, well, can you leave Zoom on beforehand and not touch it? Or maybe you can even play with it, or maybe really isolated and suffering or not. And like such this legal conversation around that. Actually, I'm having a knee-jerk reaction against that for me, but it's not a judgment about others. I could see why others would want to do it. I'm just like sick of Zoom because I'm on Zoom meetings all day. And for me, there's something sacred about sort of the social media communicative technology piece of Sabbath and holidays. And I kind of don't want to break that, even if it means that the family members and friends who we love having at our Seder, they make the Seder. I feel and also I'm not alone. I have a wife and a daughter. If I were like a bachelor or someone who was elderly and was just going to be alone, I think I might feel differently. So I want to name that. But part of me wants to just see, well, like, what will an intimate Seder look like without the sort of, it won't be as cacophonous, it won't be as messy and disorganized. And that's where the fun is usually. But maybe this is a chance for like a more intimate or introspective Seder. So I think there are 2 possibilities. One is like a technological Seder where people are going to use Zoom and share media and raise their hands. And it could be that Zoom is a better format for talking than an actual Seder. I grew up going to Seders. I hope, I'm sure my family's watching, but like there are a few people at the end who are in their own conversation about sports and we're like, when do we eat and why are we doing this? And there were the people that like insisted on saying every word, and other people were sleeping or drinking. And it was like a little bit messy. I don't know. And we got there and it was fine, but that was part of it. But it could be on Zoom with all the boxes where you could see everyone. No one's far away. It's harder. The side conversations are in chat, so they don't disrupt the thing. That actually, I could see a Seder having a more engaging conversation over Zoom. I think the songs, though, songs are going.
It's a problem.
It doesn't work over Zoom.
No.
And songs are such a fun part of the Seder.
Right.
And there's just no substitute for being in personal presence with people.
Right.
So that's one thing. But I think if people are sort of saying, well, maybe I'll do a more intimate Seder or a Seder alone, So one thing would be like, you could go contemplative, crunchy, right? And do like a mindful eating exercise with the matzah. By crunchy, I mean crunchy, like hippie crunchy,
Right,
not
right.
matzah, soft matzah.
The opposite of crunchy with the matzah.
Yeah. So you could really, like, if the matzah is supposed to prompt the story and you are alone, I think what I would do is, some people have done like mindfulness exercises with the raisin, right? Where you slowly have the raisin in your mouth and you like suddenly notice, there are these ridges I feel on my tongue and the juices. And, some people like that, some people don't, whatever the yum yuck experience of that is, good, bad, otherwise, a lot of people have a different relationship to their raisin after such an exercise. And so matzah is kind of supposed to be the mindful eating exercise that prompts this whole thing. It's related. This is actually a chance not to kind of mindlessly eat the matzah amidst a debate you're having with your uncle, but to sit there and like, how is this matzah different from bread? Like, how is it similar? To really notice the matzah and just be present with it. And the same with the bitter herbs, like to sense the bitterness, other kinds of things like that. So I think there are opportunities for that. Something I've heard some friends suggest is to have people who would normally be at your Seder send questions they're thinking about and do a question swap. And then think about those questions at the Seder and then like report on it at some other time.
I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about when you were just earlier on, when you were describing the matzah, was like, we're supposed to, I mean, the Passover Seder has kind of two dimensions to it. One is to remember when we were slaves and the other is to experience freedom. And a lot of times I think we experience the freedom part more because we've made a wonderful meal and there's wine and everything. I always wonder whether this year, almost without thinking, we're going to be able to experience the deprivation part in a different way than we have before, than we usually do. And maybe it's not something that we would want to ever do again on a Passover, but to have one Passover in our life where maybe we don't have all of the foods the way that we usually do, the symbolic foods even, or that we've had to make the matzah and maybe it didn't turn out so good or whatever. But like it maybe makes it a little bit easier to imagine that thing that we're supposed to imagine at the Seder, which is that we actually were slaves.
Right. I mean, because there's this interesting line, like this year we're slaves and next year we hope to be free in Jerusalem, right? And like, I think, right, like people are excited about like next year in Jerusalem. People say it as if like it's here already with joy and it's a song. But right, maybe this is the year like, no, this year we're slaves has a different resonance. I was thinking about this passage, which is very controversial. Spill out your wrath on the nations that do not know you, right? And it's this sort of Jewish plea for vengeance in the traditional text of the Seder, against the oppressors of the Jewish people. And maybe because of the xenophobic overtone or other overtone, or just the vengeance licensing that occurs, spill out your wrath. There's this bloodthirstiness to it, which is not, a lot of people are not proud of. I think many people have eliminated it. But thinking about sort of flipping this notion of anger, I was thinking about this year, I'm like angry about all the people who like are perfectly able to distance, but aren't, or like, what's the place of like wrath in like punishment of collective? Who would I like? I don't know. There's just all these negatives, not to be avoided, but just non-pleasant aspects to the Seder. The bitter herbs, the bricks. Like maybe this year is the year to have a sadomasochistic Seder.
Well, I wanted to at least in the couple minutes that we have remaining, I mean, I think I want to mention three things and then have you say whatever you want, but then also maybe if there are other things, we can go a little overtime if you want to say a few other things. But I'll just share with you the three things that I was really thinking about in relation to the soft matzah and the conversation that we've been having. Number one, just to throw out an idea that I think Lex and I talked about in the Judaism Unbound podcast, but that soft matzah gives you an opportunity to do something that hard matzah does not, which is to make it into a burrito. And I think that potentially that makes the Hillel sandwich, that moment where we put all of the different symbols together in one and eat it together. Like, I think that potentially makes that easier and more powerful. And I also wonder, to the extent that we were thinking about it in terms of the issues relating to immigration that are going on, but I also sort of wonder whether it maybe makes us think about like packing things up or taking a few things with her, something, I don't know, I just would encourage people to think about like the wrapping up in a burrito instead of just putting things on 2 hard crackers being something that potentially enables us to do something different. The other question that I wanted to ask you was about some of the other symbols, like let's say it's hard, let's say we can't find horseradish. Like, are there ways to think about some of those other foods that we eat at the Seder in ways that make it doesn't have to be as kind of restrictive as people tend to think about it as being, and it's actually more, as long as the food does X, you can use, can you use salsa? I mean, I don't know, like that's a question in terms of how the tradition is. And then the third thing I just wanted to ask you about was what you had said really early on about this moment being potentially opening up new thinking about our collective responsibility and our the collectiveness of the problems and the collectiveness of the need to solve them in ways that maybe we've never experienced before in our lifetime.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got burrito, salsa, and I'm noticing a theme, and
I
collective.
didn't even think of that, but yes.
So on the
Can I just have a
burrito-
Mexican meal and it's a Seder? It counts as a Seder.
This is really interesting because normally, right, Seder symbols have divided more conservative and more progressive religious communities, right? Like oranges and other symbols and Miriam's, all these things, and so the Orthodox community, many in the Orthodox community get upset at these new traditions, and others get upset at the Orthodox lack of a willingness to go along with any kind of innovation, even ones that don't violate any laws, but just are symbolic. But actually, you've suggested the perfect bridge, which is nice. It's like the bipartisan compromise that solves all problems. And in this way, people don't realize when it says Hillel haya korech, that he would make a korech. That's what it says. So what was the big deal? Like, Hillel made it like, what's so exciting about that? So the Torah says, al matzot me'arim yochlu. They had the Passover sacrifice, the goat, and the Torah says that you should eat that al matzot with matzah and bitter herbs. It's describing the recipe. And the main interpretation of the rabbis was at the same time. That's the interpretation of the verse. Like, you should have on the same plate, you eat them. But Hillel made a wrap, and korech actually means wrap from kricha. He made a burrito. So Hillel took the verse uber literally. He said, no, you can't just eat them together in one meal. You have to eat them together in one bite as a wrap. And so he would eat matzah and goat or lamb and bitter herb as a burrito, as a wrap. So actually, when people make a sandwich, that's just because their matzah got ruined. But originally it was a wrap. So this would be like, the immigration aspect is a whole nother thing, because it's the social justice matzah symbol that's actually in the Torah, is to have a wrap. But yeah, soft matzah will present you with the opportunity to actually do that, right? To make this shawarma wrap. Oh, okay, we don't have the sacrificial goat anymore. Maybe you will, I don't know. I had Greek neighbors growing up that used to do that sometime of the year. So that's one piece, is that actually that's what Hillel's big insight was make a wrap. And everyone who made a sandwich has been doing it wrong. They should be making a wrap. And so finally this year they can. They can live Hillel. Two, this depends on how bound you feel to Jewish law, I think, in part, right? For people that feel bound to Jewish law, so the bitter herb, there are different species of bitter herbs in the Mishnah, and this, classic rabbinic text spelled out, and probably something like a bitter lettuce, according to academics, is the main thing. Some people use romaine, some people think it's more like an arugula, but actually horseradish is got some heat. And it does have some bitterness, but I think people kind of know it as like the hot thing, the spicy thing. And there's this, sort of, I don't know if there's like a masculinity of horseradish that develops, but I think there is, to name maybe a gendered component to the horseradish. So, so the horseradish is probably not the main, it's one of the things in the Mishnah, but it's probably not the ideal. A lettuce is the ideal, but I suppose you could feel unbound by the things that academics say are those 5 things in the Mishnah and just do the bitterness. I mean, it's a rabbinic command, and if you don't have it, but I think this is a good time to sort of we're thinking about, we can't find like a good shank bone. We're struggling to get one. And it's a symbol of two cooked dishes. The Talmud says one of them they used beets. So we're thinking, and our daughter is allergic to eggs, pretty strongly allergic. And so we're like, well, the egg. And so I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble here, but in the Talmud, they used rice and beets. Now we're Ashkenazic, we generally don't have rice on Passover, but maybe we'll put a beet on our. So there is this way in which there's more flexibility than people think, but there are strong customs, which are also really effective. So I don't know. I think that's personal. Certainly things like what you use for the charoset, or one thing, karpas. This is important, I think. One of the big things that messes people up at the Seder is they're hungry and they're drunk early, because wine early, no food. So there's a debate about you should only have a little bit of the karpas, one of the early appetizers in the Seder, because of this blessing issue. If I eat too much, I might require an after blessing. I haven't made the blessing on bread yet. I've created my own like quasi meal, and now I need a blessing after the meal, before the meal. So people advise, it's like the matzah became flat because of stringency. So people advise not eating a lot of karpas to avoid this blessing debate. But really, many authorities like the Maimonides and the Vilna Gaon felt you should eat a lot of karpas and just deal with the blessing issue, whatever. So I'm going to say we have like a karpas salad every year with all the different traditions of what karpas is. Potatoes, parsley, we put in some carrots, some onion. We make like a potato salad and have like a formal appetizer course, because it is after this sort of Roman thing where they would have this like course of appetizer. So I don't know. I think it's, once the rules are breaking down, it naturally leads to more experimentation in all areas. And I think that's probably a great thing.
Yeah. And I do think that, like you were saying earlier, that the deep idea. I mean, we're trying to talk a little bit about practicalities, because we talked to B'nai Lepi yesterday about philosophy. We'll probably talk to other people about philosophy. We're also talking to other people about practicalities. But I do think that it is an opportunity to just maybe finish on this question of the philosophy and the meaning of Passover and the purpose of Passover. And you. In orienting the matzah factory, the profits to go against human trafficking, clearly it's anchored in that. And I also think like talking about what does it mean to have Passover in a time of coronavirus, I think is like, my feeling is that if Judaism, if Passover doesn't have anything to teach us, to tell us about how we might conduct ourselves and what we should be concerned about and making sure happens in a time of coronavirus, then I start to raise questions of like, what's the point of it all? Like, why bother wasting all our time on Judaism if it doesn't actually tell us anything about what to do in our time? But I think it does tell us, or it does have the capacity to tell us things. And I think that this question of collective responsibility, it may well be one of the most significant. So maybe you could take us home with that.
Yeah, thank you for like, normally I'm in the clouds and I've gotten into the weeds here about like parsley salads. So going back to the places where I prefer to be. Yeah, so I think, the powerful piece of Passover is this notion of atem yad atem et nefesh. Like, the soul of the illegal alien, right? What it's like as Jewish people repeatedly to be unwelcomed, unwanted, have your boats turned away, be enslaved, be discriminated against, and oppressed. And now that you're free, it's so easy to not have gratitude for that freedom. And so we'll have this great meal and there's this gratitude component. It's so easy to forget what that is, or to become and say, well, they did it to us, and now it's our turn to do it to other people. This life been tough for me, and finally I made it, which I think is an attitude a lot of my people in like the generations just older than me have had. I've heard expressed a lot of like, they gave it to us and we'll give it to other people. Not in a mean way, not like we're going to become Nazis, but God forbid, but the sense of like, we don't have to run. So I think Passover really does kind of say two things: that there's a deep responsibility to reenact both the gratitude as a festive meal, but also this enslavement. That's one piece. And I think the other is, it's one symbol. The matzah is the food they ate as slaves, and it's the food they ate on the way out. So I think the one symbol tells us that, right, like the person who doesn't have paid sick leave, and so they can't leave work, because they can't live otherwise. And even with a government bailout, it's weeks in coming and their bills happen at the end of the month and they could get evicted. Like that person is not unrelated to you. The matzah is the fruit of freedom and of slavery, right? Because they're going to get you sick when they pass you in the street. So like there's something very palpable about the coronavirus that is like, I mean, I want to say it's like matzah. That's a horrible thing to say in some ways, but it does that job. And so I think what Passover kind of has done is it is supposed to, maybe the coronavirus teaches us how Passover is supposed to work. Eating the matzah, and I think it's really the matzah is the central aspect, supposed to do that thing internally where it makes us realize that other people's plights are tied up in our own, and that it's not that we ought to have empathy for them. In one collective, what freedom means is using that position to advance our collective good. That's the Jewish goal. And so matzah is supposed to do that viscerally, but I actually think the coronavirus is doing it much better, right? Because suddenly Congress is passing temporary paid sick leave for everyone. But the issue is, what about the day after, right? So what about the day after Egypt? Is the same analog as what about the year after coronavirus,
right,
when small business loans and paid sick leave expire and people go back to dying of the flu because they still don't have it. It's just not as deadly to wealthy people.
right.
So I think that's the challenge, is like, what's the in-depth annual reminder of the coronavirus? Like we almost ought to have a ritual that says, remember when we were afraid when other people were sick that it might kill us or might kill our grandparents?
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's, I think that's a good way to wrap this up, because I think it's really, the Passover, I mean, I've said this before, but I just really feel like this year we don't have to imagine what it's like to be stuck at home with a plague and hoping that the angel of death will pass over our house. Like, we don't have to imagine that. And we made a whole holiday to remember that and related elements. And you could easily imagine a new holiday being made from this experience. And if not a new holiday, then maybe adding a new valence to Passover, and the timing is exquisite. And so maybe that's something that we ought to, that could be a topic for discussion at the Seder, right? I mean, people are saying, what am I going to talk about at the Seder this year? Because, we're used to, going around and reading the Haggadah. And I'm like, well, I think there's some interesting things to talk about. And that's kind of the whole point of Passover.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like a symbol of this, a tangible symbol, is actually Fox's You Bet syrup. I don't know if other people, this is a weird note to end on, but I feel like I always have to mention in any Passover conversation. It's a chocolate syrup that we always had growing up on Passover, and I think a lot of people did. And in the store now, they have a fair trade Fox's You Bet, and that's like the mixing of two very different worlds, and what that shows is like they're aware that the people that produce the chocolate often are slaves, and so they've made a commitment to procure their chocolate for Passover. Mainly, it's a kosher for Passover chocolate syrup from people who are free. So it's not just that the coronavirus reminds us of this. Even now, our eating patterns were always like this. We were tied up in the fates of people who we are there's an oppression component to it too, which is if you might be sick and you go out, you might be oppressing other people. And like, we're always both like responsible for the fate of people who are oppressed and maybe oppressing people ourselves in ways that we don't realize. And so this, no one is a villain here, really, right? Everyone just needs to, like, it doesn't really matter whose fault, what like we all just need to do it. So there's something about that.
Well, thank you so much, Barry, for teaching us to make matzah and for this great conversation. And I think both will be really helpful to people as they work on planning their Passover this year.
Thank you so much. And for jewishLIVE generally.
Thanks.